Hello, this is lecture 4. This will replace our class on September 30th, and we will now talk about the Enclave culture in this next 15 minutes. And then in the following couple of videos, we will review the basic essentials of fundamentalism and how you need to deal with them in your paper. So before we talk about the Enclave culture, we want to make clear that the truth is that even those who remain quiescent and distant and try to keep the outside world at arm's length cannot do so. Because not only do we experience what we've talked about in the past of globalism, in which we can say that the entire world has become a kind of global village, where people are rubbing shoulders with one another in sometimes uncomfortable ways. They can't really separate from one another. So all fundamentalists, in one way or another, even those who live within an enclave culture, which we will talk about shortly, all interact in one way or another with the outside world. Even the Hasidim who live in the back alleys of Jerusalem or in the ghettos of Brooklyn, even the Taliban who might be in some caves in Afghanistan, and even the small town Christian fundamentalists, whether they're in Latin America, whether they're in the United States, elsewhere, all of these groups generally interact with the outside world. They are not isolated completely within the boundaries of their tradition, and in a sense that makes them part of the modern world. They can try to make believe that the outside world is irrelevant to them, distant from them, that they can somehow shut it out, but they live only in small or in relatively limited enclaves. Some of these fundamentalists, as we've seen, the world conquerors, they try to gradually penetrate the world. That even from their cave in Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden and his group, for example, have made an effort and have, in an extraordinarily successful way, penetrated into the modern world. We all know about them. We're all curious about them. They some of those who penetrate the world try, as again we'll use the example of Al-Qaeda, to dramatically engage and overthrow that world. And certainly that's part of their effort. And that's certainly part of the effort that we'll see when we talk about, for example, churches like the Lynchburg Church of the late Jerry Falwell, which started out as a small southern church and morphed into a major political force that accounted in many ways for the resurgence of Christian fundamentalist political forces in this country. So some of those fundamentalists who seem to be in their own worlds ultimately try to penetrate and conquer the world, and have been, we must say, in the world in which we now inhabit, they've been extraordinarily successful, much more successful than anyone would have imagined. Some, on the other hand, as we have said, and we will see again now when we talk about the enclave culture and life in the enclave, some of them try to withdraw to the periphery of the modern world, afraid that contact with it is just too dangerous. That is what we mean when we talk about the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, as we'll see among the Jews, or the Hasidim, which is a group among the Haredim. Among Christians, we'll see when we talk about Bob Jones University and the whole Bob Jones Christian fundamentalist world, we'll see that although Christians are on a mission, and they always are missionizing, and in that sense can never completely withdraw, as indeed Muslims, both Islam and Christianity are missionizing religions, as we'll see. They have it as essentially in their DNA, we might say, to convert the world to their point of view, unlike the Jews, which have by and large not been a missionizing religion. So some of those, even among the missionizing religions, try to withdraw to the periphery, biding their time, waiting for some sign from heaven, or, as we've said in the past, when some crisis, some trigger event forces them to go from their quiescent to their active state. And of course, there are some fundamentalist groups who decline so much that they almost seem to cease to exist. But as we've seen, the beliefs of fundamentalism are so powerful, so deeply felt, that even groups that seem to have declined and disappeared have this extraordinary way of resurrecting themselves. In any event, when they withdraw, as indeed even when they are trying to take over the world, but certainly when they are on the outside, when they are in a sense not in control, they appear to be a kind of counterculture. As we've said, they offer counter recipes for how to live, what to believe, what is the moral right and wrong. And while they look to the past and to their traditions to inform them as to what is really the true way of thinking, in fact, they are part of the modern world, and they figure out where to withdraw, how to pull back, by looking at the demands of the modern world. Well, we want to talk about enclave culture, and I want to suggest two things when we talk about enclave culture. First of all, the essay by Sivan is really a perfect model for what your final papers should be like, because it takes very specific examples from particular fundamentalist groups, and it puts them within the framework of an argument that explains what fundamentalism is. So I urge you to read Sivan very carefully as you possibly can. I know we're finishing this section now on the essentials of fundamentalism, but the enclave culture is such a wonderful melding of all of the things that we want to talk about this semester, that if you have really assimilated it, if you've learned it well, if you've reviewed it well, I think it will stand you in good stead as a model of what it is that you want to produce in your final writing project. So the first aspect of the enclave, which is, enclave means a kind of separate area. It's geography, it's geographically separate often, and it's certainly culturally and socially separated. And very often those who live in the enclave feel that for whatever reason they are not in control of the overall culture. They're not in control not because they shouldn't be, but because history has gone awry, because something has changed, some events have occurred, perhaps people haven't been sufficiently faithful, perhaps the erosion, the seductions of the modern world have worked their way for a variety of reasons. They feel that somehow they are in the wilderness. They are, to say that they are out of power, that they are in exile. The concept for the ultra-Orthodox Jews, as we'll see, is particularly in Israel, the Jewish state, many of these feel somehow that they are in exile among the Jews. That is, they're somehow out of power. The Christian fundamentalists in this country, for many, many years, certainly after the Scopes trial and from the 1920s until their resurgence in the 1970s, many of the Christian fundamentalists felt as if they were in exile. And many of them now, during in the last couple of years, since the victory of the Democrats under President Obama, many of them have felt that they are in exile. And there is certainly that same kind of feeling among many Islamists who, as we'll see, in many cases felt as if their countries, the domains of Islam, were suddenly or somehow taken over by the powers of the West, and that in their own countries they were not in charge, that Western forces or people who were proxies, representatives of the West, were somehow taking over for them. In all of these cases and in others, the people who are fundamentalists often feel that they are in exile in their own land, in a place where they believe they should be in charge. And that this has happened because of the breakdown of social order, because of a kind of moral breakdown. That feeling of being in exile, on the one hand, makes them feel disenfranchised and arouses a feeling of resentment, which in its quiescent sense, people say, that's okay, we'll just worry about ourselves. But in the activist sense, say, this is an injustice which must be corrected. And all of them have come to feel that this exile that we experience, this being out of power, this somehow being a living like a minority even though we are right, all this fundamentalists deeply and with great conviction believe will someday come to an end. Either if they wait patiently, that's the quiescent view, if they just wait patiently, the others, the enemy, will either be undone by God, or they will self-destruct in a kind of Armageddon. So either if they wait patiently, or sometimes, as we'll see, fundamentalists believe that they can hasten the day when they return to power. Often this is articulated as, we can hasten the redemption. And messianism, the idea that there is a Messiah at the end of days, and he will come, and when he comes, he will change the world. So many of these fundamentalists are also messianists, in the sense of thinking that there is something we can do to hasten that day, to make Jesus come back sooner, to make the Messiah appear, to make the 12th Imam, if we're talking about Shia Islamism, to bring about that of those events in history which will bring God's kingdom here on earth, just as the prophet promised. So while they're waiting, they need always to remember that they are being surrounded. They are surrounded by enemies, and that they must not assimilate. They must not, if it's the case of Islam, they must not Westoxicate. If it's the case of Christian fundamentalism, they must not become secular. They must not, in some ways, give up the ideals of their moral universe. And if they're Jews, the same notion. They must not acculturate, they must not assimilate, they must not sacrifice their values and way of life for political expediency or for social satisfaction. And the thing that they're all convinced of is what will protect them is their solidarity with one another, and solidarity is a very important part of this, and their attachment, their faithfulness to religious tradition. They need to be strengthened in their religion. As long as they purge what is rotten from the outside, as long as they cleanse, with quotation marks around it, cleanse themselves of the toxins of Western culture, of the toxins, in the case of Jews, of what they view as non-Jewish happiness and satisfaction and values, the toxin of modern liberalism, secular rationalism, as the Christians might say, if they purge themselves of this element that comes from the outside, if they banish it, if they keep the boundaries high, then they will survive. Well, This will be the